Traffic lights are probably something most people don't pay attention to. To the untrained eye, they all look the same. However, most people don't realise that Victoria retains some of the last examples of many historic traffic lights from Australia. New South Wales and Western Australia got rid of every single auto traffic light in the early 2010s, along with the Northern Territories and most of Queensland. The only states with any amount of old traffic lights are South Australia, with probably less than 10, and Queensland probably has a few obscure ones. Victoria miraculously kept a lot of its vintage traffic lights around. Today, I'm going to have a brief look into the history of traffic lights in Victoria, and all the types you can still see today. And maybe after this video, it'll help you notice and appreciate some of Australia's 60-year-old technology that's still in use today. Throughout the video, I'm going to refer to halogen as incandescent, just for convenience. Basically, anything that isn't LED, I'll just say is incandescent. The first actual traffic lights installed in all of Victoria was in 1928 at the corner of Swanston and Flinders Street. They were manually controlled and operated and were only used for 1 year. While Sydney got their first automatic traffic lights in 1933, Melbourne's first prototype traffic lights weren't installed until 1937. They were installed on the corner of Gertrude and Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, but were again removed not too long after, mostly due to the lack of legitimacy behind them, and people didn't yet understand them or fully trust them. The first automatic traffic quote-unquote lights that were installed around Melbourne were the Marshallite traffic lights, which started being installed after 1945, with the first intersection being Brunswick and Johnston Street in Fitzroy. These sort of traffic lights featured a clock face with an arrow pointing to the different colors matching the traffic lights nowadays. The only existing examples of these today are preserved ones. These ones at Chelsea are probably the most notable, even having the pedestrian buttons as well as a pedestrian signal mock-up, which I'm pretty sure didn't exist back in the day. They're pretty cool, but I think they wouldn't have worked very well. It's pretty hard to tell whether to go or not, and I'm glad we don't have them nowadays. It would probably have motorists straining to see when the hand ticks over to green, and who knows how many collisions it caused. Marshalites lasted quite long, surprisingly, into the 1970s, still being used at some intersections along the Nepean Highway, despite their not very functional design. The history now gets a little fuzzy, because after Marshallite came some real traffic lights. Two brands initially started supplying traffic lights around Victoria as well as Australia, those being Eagle Signal, known as G&W Eagle Signal at the time, and AWA coming a few decades before Eagle, although I'll talk about them second, since Eagle Signal were definitely a more prominent traffic light company back in the day, at least in Melbourne. Remarkably, a lot of the signals from Eagle and AWA still exist today, although more AWA lights exist since they outlasted Eagle Signal. I'll discuss each brand of traffic light on its own. So anyways, let's get into Eagle Signal traffic lights, my personal favorite types. They were everywhere in Melbourne at one point, first appearing in their bright yellow color with some distinct setups you no longer see today. There are still examples of many different types of these Eagle Signal lights today. The oldest designs are these ones with sections on the top and the bottom of the light, and nowadays only exist on Exhibition Street in the city, and also previously existed on the intersections of Arden Street and Errol Street in West Melbourne until around 2011. After that were the most common Eagle Signal lights seen in many photos from around that time, being the bright yellow large lights with these large separated backgrounds, as well as directional lights separated from the main lights. These traffic lights are almost extinct in Melbourne now, with only a few intersections still retaining them. Another thing to note is that almost every single yellow light was painted to black some point around the early to mid 2000s. So many of the oldest style Eagle lights are all black. At this point, there's only one known yellow traffic light in Victoria and possibly all of Australia, apart from some pedestrian lights that we'll discuss later, being this overhead light on Princess Street in Kew, also being my favourite traffic light. In a lot of these examples, you can see the yellow paint showing through the black paint, with this traffic light in Preston being a good example. One thing you may have also noticed is that there are large and small Eagle Signal lights. Historically, the large lights, which I refer to as 12-inch, were more common than the smaller 8-inch versions. However, nowadays the 12-inch light is a relic of the past and are becoming fewer and fewer, at least in Victoria. Here's some of the older 12-inch Eagle lights. This one at Park Street is really nice. This type in particular, with the visible larger back, were only used on overhead cantilevers. There are some other Eagle pedestrian lights here too. I'm not 100% certain on how the design of Eagle lights evolved after this, but I can just give a general description of each type of light, just speculating what came after what. So branded Eagle Signal lights, I assume, were the next to start appearing. Most of the old ones had blank backs. These are the most common type of eagle lights still remaining around Melbourne. These lights on Blackburn Road have the older G&W Eagle signal logo on the back, which really gives a vintage feel, especially with the weathering. I believe the only lights left with the older logo on them are the smaller 8-inch lights. A while after this though, they changed their logo to be a bit more modern. The new design is a simple eagle with eagle signal on the top, which I think looks a lot nicer. Another relatively common eagle signal light variant around Melbourne is the pedestrian light. These are far more common than the regular lights themselves, although they are much harder to notice. They have a really nice vintage look to them and have a very boxy appearance. These are also the only variant of eagle signal light to still exist in regional Victoria, with one existing here in Wodonga as well as Geelong, and possibly in some other regional cities like Bendigo. Another variant of this light is the give way to pedestrians light. These are really cool, but they're also pretty small, so it might be hard for road users to see. There are also variants that say no right turn as well as road closed. These exist in the city as well as in Geelong. The ones that currently exist all have an LED inside, although maybe there's some that I'm missing that still have the older lights. Another thing to remember is I could have definitely missed some of them looking around, so you never know how many could still be hiding. The most recent type or brand of eagle signal is Durasig. It's not known when they switched over to this name. The newer eagle signal logo was reused when they switched to the new name. Durasig lights aren't super unique in my opinion. They look very similar to Aldridge, but have the Durasig branding on the back as well as on the lenses in the middle. There aren't a lot of Durasig lights around, although due to the similarities with Aldridge, they're pretty hard to notice. Eventually, Eagle Signal / Durasig was bought out by Aldridge, an up-and-coming traffic light producer in Melbourne. And now that we've finished with Eagle Signal, we can move on to AWA. The first AWA lights were already in use in Sydney, while Melbourne was still stuck with the Marshallite. Although eventually AWA lights started appearing around Melbourne too, being installed at the same time as Marshallites up until the late 1960s when Eagle Signal came around. AWA was Eagle's main competition until Aldridge came around. However, AWA ended up lasting a decent while longer than Eagle Signal. The earliest design of AWA lights are actually completely gone from Australia. The last known older AWA traffic light, being a 12-inch light, existed at the intersection of Arden Street and Errol Street until 2011, the same intersection I mentioned earlier. You can still see evidence of this nowadays with the newer light using the same hanging mount, and you can also see it on older Street View. It's a shame these are gone, since I really like the super old tin look. They're also the only type of traffic light not to be separated into different segments. Miraculously, I managed to buy one of these lights from Facebook, although I'm yet to get it working. This also allowed me to discover that at some point they were refurbished by Eagle Signal. The next known variant of AWA light after the earliest ones are some of the rarest types of traffic light in general around Melbourne, with only a few known intersections to still have them. Some examples being the Separation Street and High Street intersection in Northcote, as well as the Russell Street and Flinders Lane intersection in the city, although the ones here look a lot newer. These designs look very similar to Eagle lights, with the hatches for lights, although the backs were quite different. The AWA logo is also visible on the front, which I think looks very cool. While the older AWA are very uncommon nowadays, the newest design of AWA, right before the company exited the traffic scene in the late 1990s, are some of the most common incandescent traffic lights still in use around Melbourne. While they are far outnumbered by Aldridge lights, there is still a good chance you pass some of these on your commute. They all look almost identical to Aldridge lights, and the only way I can usually tell them apart are the logo on the back. AWA was absorbed by a different company called Tyco in the year 2000, which I will talk about later. And now we're up to the first company which lived into the modern era, Aldridge. They're by far the most common traffic light around Melbourne, as they have large numbers of both incandescent and LED lights. In all honesty, I'm not too interested in the different types of Aldridge incandescents, but it is nice how many there still are around Victoria. I'll quickly show all the different types that I've seen, but I think they're no big deal, and I'm pretty sure they're all as rare as each other. One type of Aldridge incandescent light I'll talk about, though, are the 12-inch lights. And they're quite an interesting case. They aren't necessarily the oldest lights, but they weren't installed in mass numbers. They were mostly installed to be seen easier by drivers. There are also some other weird intersections with 12-inch lights where it's probably unnecessary. I'll show a few as well as some of my favorites. This intersection in Auburn is one of those weird intersections where 12-inch lights don't really seem all too necessary, but it is very cool to see. Most of the time, they're installed at places like this where it makes it easier to see. Another favorite of mine are these set of lights at this tram crossing in Parkville. Out of all Aldridge incandescents, these are by far the rarest, and also my favorite. I think that Vic Roads is trying to get rid of these lights though. Weirdly, a lot of intersections in older Street View show Aldridge 12-inch lights. Just a theory though. Aldridge were the first traffic light company to make LED traffic lights. The first ever type of LED traffic lights made were clear LEDs, and these type of lights are very rare nowadays. In the past, there were a few more intersections with them, but at the moment, there are only two places I know of that have them. The most interesting being the Prospect Hill Road and Burke Road intersection in Camberwell. This intersection is one of my favorites, featuring a wide variety of Aldridge lights, including clear LED pedestrian lights, which are also extremely rare, and 12-inch lights. The other location with clear LEDs is Westall Road, with a few of the intersections along it featuring them, although they do look a little different to the ones at Camberwell. One other interesting type of clear LED made by Aldridge, I'm assuming since the housing is Aldridge, is this unique pedestrian light, which to my knowledge only exists here in Camberwell. These are the only Aldridge 12-inch LED lights that I know of. Before we get into the actual start of LED traffic lights, I want to take a look at the other slightly less notable traffic light companies which also made incandescent traffic lights. First is my personal favorite light, which is Bob Panich. Aside from the funny name, I think these are some of the nicest looking traffic lights. They have a curved back and this cool diagonal crisscross pattern on the lens. These traffic lights are quite rare around Melbourne, as they were only installed for a short time around the 90s. These traffic lights were actually the brand that were most common in New South Wales and other states, ironically now only remaining in numbers around Melbourne, despite never really taking off here. There's also one more type of Bob Panich light around, which are these very odd countdown timers. Here's some at Q, although there might be more elsewhere. These are the only type of Bob Panich 12-inch lights used in Victoria. Anyways, the design on the lenses of the incandescent lights look really nice and unique in my opinion, and I wish there were more around. Next up is Excelsior, also known as Excelite, which is another Aldridge lookalike. This is another company which made traffic lights around the late 80s to early 90s. The main way to tell these apart is the back, which has a very unique shape, along with the branding. Most of the Excelsior lights around Melbourne are pedestrian lights, and there are very few Excelsior lights that aren't, such as here at the intersection of A. Beckett Street and Elizabeth Street in the city. While they definitely have a cool design, they aren't super interesting, although I do like them better than the generic Aldridge incandescents. Now we get to a slightly more interesting company, Parco, short for J.G. Parr Co. This company made pedestrian wigwag lights, as shown here. These were quite common around Melbourne, and up until the 2000s, a large chunk of pedestrian crossings used these. Nowadays, however, barely any of these are left, only being two instances of them to my knowledge, one on Macaulay Road near the station and the other being on Kilby Road in Kew East. Also cool that this one is yellow. It's a shame that these are almost entirely gone, because they are very unique and look a lot nicer than any other pedestrian wigwag, other than the equal signal ones. Now that I've talked about the older types of traffic lights, we'll finally delve into the LEDs, LEDs standing for light emitting diode, and I'm sure you're familiar with these type of lights. After the clear LEDs were trialed, the first mass-produced type of LED traffic light were these Aldridge LEDs. These are by far the most common type of traffic lights around Victoria and all of Australia, and you can tell them apart from other traffic lights as you can see each LED individually, like a bunch of dots. These lights are pretty boring, and they have the same back as the latest incandescent lights. It took Aldridge a little while before they made a newer design. Of course, there were also a few other variations of their LEDs design, the differences mainly being on the back. Their newest design is not very widely used, having a similar design to Braums, which I'll talk about next, featuring a single light source which is supposed to be nicer for drivers. These are also quite uncommon. When Aldridge started making LEDs, they were the only company still making traffic lights in Australia. However, in the early 2010s, a new company arose called Braums. In my opinion, the Braums traffic lights are the best looking modern traffic lights. They have an almost incandescent feel since they use an LED bulb behind the lens. These traffic lights are now the standard traffic lights being installed around Australia. There isn't too much to say about them really. Recently, Aldridge became Braums' sister company, so they pretty much control the traffic light scene in Australia. Swarco is another company which they work closely with. I'm just going to quickly mention some other notable LED traffic light companies which aren't super uncommon or anything around Victoria, but they just aren't all that interesting. The first one being Tyco, which is pretty common and is very easy to tell apart from others. They're sorta cool, I guess. This is the company that ended up absorbing the traffic light division of AWA. The lights have a distinct flat lens look, and I'm not really too sure how to describe them, so I'll just show a comparison and some examples. These are nicer than Aldridge and look very clean. Kalington is another brand of traffic light, which also looks like Tyco and Aldridge, but these are a lot less common, and I've only seen them in the city. I also have no idea when this company came about. The main way to tell them apart is the Australia shape on the side, as well as their name on the front. And the last brand I'll talk about is Swarco, which I briefly mentioned works alongside Braums. Swarco traffic lights look quite unique, with a white back and different shape to normal traffic lights. However, they are used very sparsely, really only at Swanson Street and Burke Street in the city. I'm pretty sure we've covered basically all the types of traffic lights you can still find around Victoria now. Next, I wanted to talk about a pretty iconic part of Australia as a whole, the pedestrian button. The modern variant is known as the PB5 crosswalk button. These were actually made by a few different companies throughout their existence. I'm not sure of every company, but if you check the side of some of these buttons, you can find branding like Excelsior, Aldridge, and Braums more recently. Since these are so widespread now around Victoria and Australia, even some other countries, most people wouldn't know that what came before, the push buttons. There were probably a few companies making these. Most of them have Aldridge branding, but Eagle Signal and AWA probably made variants too, as well as this random UK company. These are some of my favorite bits of vintage traffic technology, which is a shame since these are also some of the rarest bits of equipment left. At the time of writing, I'm only aware of 5 intersections with these buttons, with 7 buttons in total across all of them. But there are also 2 buttons at the Marshallite display, which I showed at the start of the video, although these have seen better days. The buttons have an awesome old look to them, and the button is super satisfying to press. They also have the same clicking noises as modern PB5 buttons. They also light up once you've pressed them, although the lights seem to die very often. Keep a lookout for these next time you're out, since I've probably missed a few of them when looking. Vintage traffic lights are a part of history that most people miss, and Victoria has some of the last examples of these in Australia, so it's important that people at least recognize how significant they are before they're all gone. They're just as important as any other piece of infrastructure history, like heritage buildings or bridges. I also compare old traffic lights to old bits of railway crossing equipment, which are also dwindling in the current days. If you live in Melbourne, the next time you're on a drive or a walk, try to appreciate the older traffic lights that you see. They're a great part of Australian history, and feel lucky that you live in a city that still widely uses them. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to take a look at some of these traffic lights yourself, I've manually created a map with all the old traffic lights I could find. There may be some outdated locations, but for the most part it should be accurate. And if you find any out and about that I haven't noted, please let me know in the comments. Also, make sure to check out some other cool traffic light and signal related sites. I've put them in the description. I hope to make more voiceover style videos like this in the future. I have a few videos in the works from my recent trip to Europe. I also plan to upload my original style of content too. If you liked it, make sure to subscribe, and let me know what I can do to improve. Happy exploring!